On 30th April 1967, Marines of the 3rd Division assaulted Hill 881 South near Khe Sanh. Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, lost 9 killed and 43 wounded in a single day. When recovery teams reached the dead, they found something that should not have been possible. American Marines, lying next to disassembled M16 rifles they had been trying to unjam when they were killed. And beside them, other Marines, still gripping AK-47s stripped from dead NVA soldiers. Men who had thrown down their own country's rifle in the middle of a firefight and picked up the enemy's weapon because it was the only one that worked. A congressional investigation would later conclude that the failure behind those jammed rifles bordered on criminal negligence. The rifle those Marines grabbed off the ground would become the most feared weapon of the entire war, and not only by the men it was aimed at. The rifle that killed Americans in Vietnam was not always the one the enemy carried. Sometimes it was the one the United States issued. In 1964, the Army switched the M16's propellant, replacing DuPont's IMR stick powder with Olin Matheson ball powder, against the explicit specifications of the rifle's designer, Eugene Stoner. Ball powder burned dirtier. It raised port pressure, drove the cyclic rate past its design ceiling, and deposited carbon fouling that the unchrome-lined chamber could not shed. Brass cases swelled against corroded steel, and the extractor ripped through the cartridge rim instead of pulling it free. The only fix was a cleaning rod hammered down the muzzle. Thousands of rifles shipped to Vietnam without cleaning kits. The Army's own marketing called the weapon self-cleaning. At LZ X-Ray in the Ia Drang Valley, November 1965, Lieutenant Rick Rescorla of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, assigned 3 men to every foxhole, 2 firing, 1 on his knees with a steel rod, forcing spent cases out of a chamber that would not cycle. The metallic scraping of rod against bore, the dead click of a trigger pulled on a seized action. Those were the sounds of the M16's first major battle, while the rifle in the enemy's hands never stopped firing. That rifle was not a precision instrument. It was something more dangerous in a jungle war, a weapon that simply refused to quit. Most Americans who encountered it called it an AK-47. What they were actually facing, in almost every case, was the Chinese Type 56, a milled receiver copy of Mikhail Kalashnikov's original design, manufactured at State Factory 66, beginning in 1956. Kalashnikov had built his rifle for conscript soldiers who would fight in mud, snow, and sand with no armorer and minimal training. The Type 56 inherited every one of those priorities. The action had so much room inside it that mud, sand, and carbon simply cycled through. What jammed an M16 did not register inside an AK. The bore was chrome-lined, the feature the U.S. Army had deleted from the M16 to save money, the Soviets had included as standard. And the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge had a steep taper that meant the spent case practically fell out of the chamber on extraction, the opposite of the straight-walled 5.56 that seized in a dirty gun. The M16 was the better rifle on a clean bench at 200 meters. The AK was the better rifle in a rice paddy at 50. Vietnam was a rice paddy war. Colonel David Hackworth of the 9th Infantry Division proved it with a demonstration he later described in Steel My Soldiers' Hearts. He pulled a Type 56 from a marsh where it had been buried for approximately 1 year, rusted shut, caked in black mud. Hackworth kicked the bolt back with his boot heel and squeezed the trigger. 30 rounds. The rust flaked off a receiver that still cycled. The AK performed, in his words, as though it had been cleaned that day rather than buried in the marsh for a year. One U.S. Navy combat unit would eventually log 7,400 rounds of enemy ammunition into its own official arsenal, paper-trailed, property documented, signed for. That story is coming. But first, the men who carried the enemy's rifle into the enemy's jungle. On 18th August 1966, D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment walked into a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province. 108 men, 105 Australians, and 3 New Zealand artillerymen from 161 Battery under Captain Maurice Stanley. Their commander was Major Harry Smith.
Their rifles were L1A1 self-loading rifles, heavy, semi-automatic, brutally reliable. The L1A1 did not jam, but it fired one round per trigger pull. What met them in the rubber was the 275th Viet Cong Regiment and D445 Battalion. 1,500 to 2,500 enemy soldiers. 11 Platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp was hit first. Sharp was killed. Sergeant Bob Buick took command, keyed the radio, and reported what he heard. There's at least 2 machine guns, 7.62 RPDs, and some rifles and AK-47s. They were that good that they were at round about 75 to 100 meters, they knocked over the left section. There were 6 guys there, 4 were killed, and 2 were wounded. The AK-47s and khaki uniforms on the first enemy dead told the Australians everything intelligence could not. These were not local guerrillas. These were main force regulars. The weapon identified the threat before anything else did. Rubber trees splintered under automatic fire. The deeper report of the AK cut through monsoon rain. 18 Australians were killed that day, 24 wounded. 245 enemy dead lay on the field when it was over. D Company, 6th RAR received the United States Presidential Unit Citation. Long Tan proved what the AK could do to men who carried a reliable rifle. What happened next proved what it could do for men whose own rifle had failed them. MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command Studies and Observations Group, ran the war's most dangerous missions: cross-border reconnaissance into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Recon teams of 5 or 6 Americans and 4 to 6 Montagnard or Vietnamese soldiers operated behind enemy lines for days. The casualty rate in SOG's recon companies exceeded 100%. Every operator wounded, roughly half killed. The point man on a SOG team carried an AK-47. He wore an NVA uniform, a Chinese chest rig. And when contact came, his first burst sounded exactly like the enemy's. That confusion, those 2 or 3 seconds before the NVA realized Americans were among them, was the difference between extraction and annihilation. Master Sergeant Richard Meadows of Recon Team Iowa, operating out of Fob Quantum, understood this better than anyone. On a prisoner snatch mission along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Meadows rounded a bend and found himself face to face with an NVA officer and 3 soldiers. He leveled his captured AK and said 2 words: "Good morning." The 4 NVA reached for their weapons. Meadows killed all of them in what witnesses described as one blur. SOG pointmen carried the AK not out of desperation, but out of doctrine. The weapons report that deeper, slower rhythm against the M16's higher crack bought seconds. In SOG's world, seconds were everything. John Stryker Meyer of Recon Team Idaho, operating from CCN Da Nang, ran missions where his Vietnamese pointman's son carried an AK-47 in full NVA uniform and chest rig. It was not a souvenir. It was standard operating procedure. And then there were the SEALs.
Chief Gunner's Mate Barry Enoch of SEAL Team 1 earned the Navy Cross on 9th April 1970 in Long Phu District, Ba Xuyen Province. The UDT SEAL Museum holds a Vietnam combat photograph of Enoch on operations in the Mekong Delta, holding a captured AK-47. An unnamed SEAL officer, quoted by historian Kevin Dockery, explained the logic. An M16 would stand out to the VC or NVA, telling them where and possibly who we were. The open loop closes here. The property document Dockery cited reads, 7,400 rounds of AK-47 ammunition retained for SEAL Team 2. Not a battlefield pickup,
not a war trophy. A United States Navy combat unit logging enemy ammunition into its own official supply chain, signed for on paper, stored in an American armory, issued back to American operators heading into the Mekong at night. Blackwater, nipa palm, the creak of a sampan, and the sound of an AK being charged that the enemy mistook for one of their own. The Americans feared the AK-47 enough to weaponize that fear in reverse. Colonel Jack Singlaub's SOG launched Project Eldest Son in 1967, a sabotage program that inserted a single overpressure 7.62 by 39 round into captured enemy ammunition caches along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 250,000 pounds per square inch, more than 5 times the AK's safe chamber pressure. Over the program's run, technicians prepared more than 11,500 sabotaged rifle cartridges. SOG forged Viet Cong documents blaming poor Chinese manufacturing. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne later found a dead NVA soldier holding an AK whose receiver had blown apart, the bolt driven backward through his eye socket. They blamed Chinese metallurgy. It was eldest son. The AK was not without honest weaknesses. The 7.62 by 39 dropped roughly 50 inches at 500 meters, against about 12 for the 5.56. Beyond 200 meters, the AK was markedly harder to hit with, and every loaded magazine weighed more than its M16 equivalent, a difference that multiplied across a long jungle patrol. By 1968, the M16A1, chrome-lined chamber, forward assist, corrected powder, proper cleaning kits, had largely restored conventional infantry confidence. Outside special operations units, the appetite for captured AKs faded. But the sound never did. Veterans of Ia Drang heard it in 1965. Veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan heard the same report 50 years later. That deeper, slower rhythm cutting through whatever war they happened to be fighting. The AK-47 was never feared because it was accurate. It was feared because it was present. Present when the American rifle was not. On Hill 881 South, a Marine dropped a jammed M16, stripped an AK from a dead NVA soldier, and kept fighting. Not because the enemy's rifle was the better weapon on paper, because it was the weapon that fired. The last sound a jammed M16 made was a click. The AK never clicked. It just kept firing.